Welcome to the desert. The desert. Who would have ever thought that the desert would be a good place to come to know God? It can be hot out here. Hot. All kinds of creatures out here that you have to be watchful for. And yet, as Parker Palmer puts it, the desert is a significant learning space. It was a significant learning space for Jesus. He spent time in the wilderness, and the time in the wilderness strengthened him in fulfilling his vocation in his life with Father and Holy Spirit. I want to talk about the desert in a different fashion, the desert as a metaphor. We are all going to enter the desert. I wish it wasn't this way. I wish that there wasn't any of these kinds of deserts. The heat gets turned up in the desert, in these kinds of deserts, a desert like a marriage that dissolves, a loss, a parting, having to say goodbye to somebody you don't want to say goodbye to. You want to hold on to them forever. Each one of us is going to have to bury everybody we love or be buried by them. So what the desert dwellers want to help us with is not living in a place or with an attitude that doesn't match up with reality. Rather, they want to help us learn to live before God and with friends and neighbors and sometimes enemies in such a way that love is the final result in our lives. God is not absent from the desert. He is not absent from our deserts. Sometimes when I'm praying, I'll say, "Surely, Lord, you're not asking this of me. Please don't ask this of me." And then we enter the desert. And we hang in there with God in the desert, and the heat of the desert and the demands of the desert grow us in ways we wouldn't grow if we weren't there in that very demanding, difficult place. So let me toss out slowly and hopefully contemplatively some desert disciplines and desert values, some desert principles that you, even just as we're starting out, might find helpful. The first would be this: human beings run from the truth. Ever find yourself doing that? I surely have in my life. On more than one occasion, at least twice, I was in a car or in a VW bus surrounded by large people, basketball players. I could not escape. I couldn't escape. And they started telling me about myself. "Chris, you're like this. You're like this. You're like this." And everything in me wanted to scream out, "No, I'm not. I'm not like that." I couldn't escape. I knew these guys loved me. And because they loved me, they were telling me the truth. We're sensing the truth about God, or we might be sensing the truth about our own lives, and we're tempted to flee because what the truth is seems threatening to us. We're vulnerable to the truth. Hopefully vulnerable to the truth in a good way. So what the desert dwellers would teach us is the first principle, our tendency to run from the truth that God offers us in great love. A second desert principle that you might find helpful is attentiveness. Attentiveness, where we learn to focus on those things that are really important, the kinds of things that we'll be attending to or thinking about when our lives draw to a close. Here's something that can cause problems for us. How noisy is your environment? How loud is your environment? A noisy, loud environment, by definition, will distract us. And if distraction strangles attentiveness, it's a problem. How about working at creating an environment that increases our attentiveness? Another principle has to do with habit formations. So let me ask you, what are your mental habits? When you hit a rough stretch, maybe in the desert, what's your default position? What do you fall back into in terms of how you're living and using your body physically? How about emotional habit patterns that might raise their head during a time of testing? And how about spiritual habit patterns? The desert dwellers are very interested in helping us reform and reshape basic habit patterns. They'd argue some habit patterns bring life. Some habit patterns don't bring life. And sometimes, if we are not attentive to these deeply embedded ways of thinking and living, we can fall into habits that are harmful to us, and they can be harmful to other people. The desert dwellers called them the vices. When you hear the word vice, don't become frightened or discouraged and run screaming into the night. We all struggle with these vices. There's 9 of them: anger, pride, deceit, envy, greed, fear, gluttony, lust, sloth. The first time we realize, oh, that's me, feels like you got a bucket of water tossed in your face. But that's fine. You can dry the water off in the desert. It's hot out there. When I was a younger guy, I mean probably from almost the word go, anger was an issue for me. And later issues of violence were an issue for me. And I thought to myself, can I ever change? Can I ever stop being this knucklehead who gets angry so quickly? And with help from the desert dwellers, with help from certain scriptures, with help from Jesus himself, I began to change. So let me lay out for you how we're going to walk through this series together. In each film series, we'll take a look at a given vice. We'll take a look at a virtue that in some ways is the opposite of the vice. Finally, one of the things we're going to do in each one of these sessions, I'm going to introduce you to a key desert figure. The desert world is peopled with interesting personalities, interesting men, interesting women, who all felt this call to the desert as a learning space. So let's talk about a very interesting personality. He is beloved in the Eastern Orthodox world, but loved by many Christians. His name was Antony. He was an Egyptian, a young guy, probably 19, 20. He's attending church, and he hears a teaching of Jesus. And the teaching of Jesus is something like this. I'll paraphrase. Give away everything you own and come and follow me. There was an immediacy to Antony's response. It's almost like he said to himself, all right, I'll take you up on that. And so he gave away his possessions and headed out into this learning space called the desert, where we're going to be spending quite a bit of time. At first, he just went out to the villages that were on the edge of the desert, and he would spend time there talking with old people. Sometimes it's good to talk to old people. They've just been around more. Antony would basically go out and talk and ask, Abba, do you have a word for me? Do you have something that you can impart to me if I slow down and listen and am open to what you might have to say? If I slow down and listen to what you have to say. So Athanasius, a great church father as they're called in ancient Christianity, wrote Antony's biography. And he said that Antony was like a bee. He was like a bee flying in the desert and landing on these different flowers, these mentors he found out in the desert. And he would spend time with them, listening very carefully and trying to put into practice what they were offering to him. So he finds mentors in the desert, and always in the back of, not probably in the front of his mind and in front of his heart, the greatest mentor he was seeking was Jesus. And Jesus himself had spent a lot of time in the desert, if you remember. 40 days in the wilderness at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus learned certain things and was strengthened by certain things, truths, experiences in the desert. So at the heart of desert spirituality is Jesus himself. So we'll take a look at a key desert personality. We'll take a look at a key vice. We'll take a look at a virtue. And then we'll look at a practice, a key practice. With desert spirituality, it's kind of a spirituality where boots are on the ground. It's just not about ideas. It's about key practices that we can engage in to help us to learn to love better. But it's very important to take a good look at what the problem is. If we're ill, we want from our doctor the right diagnosis, do we not? So in a manner of speaking, the Abbas and Ammas of the desert are physicians of the soul. And they can really help us get to a new place marked by the word, in block letters, hopefully in your mind, marked by the word freedom. Freedom. Freedom to do what? Freedom to love God and freedom to love other image bearers in a safe, sane, non-exploitative, holy fashion. I automatically start smiling when I start talking about that kind of love, because I think so many precious image bearers around the world are longing for people like that. And perhaps by God's grace, perhaps as we spend time together talking about these vices and these virtues and how by the power of the Holy Spirit to cultivate them in our lives, we can become people of significant love. And that's good for everyone involved.